pavilion here at COP26. My name is François Burguet, and I am a postdoc in the Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland. And today I welcome all of you here in Glasgow, but also at the Cryosphere Hubs in Stockholm and Geneva. Today's session are about ice sheets and sea level rise. And today, so the session of now, is about why committed sea level rise, a science youth dialogue. And to discuss about this, I have the pleasure to announce Twyla Moon from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and then afterwards also Jonathan Barber from the University of Bristol. After this intervention, there will be also Divya from India and Amy from the US for, the continuing of the session. So the floor is yours.
Hi, welcome, and it's so nice to see folks here and folks who are online joining us. And I wanted to start a little bit today by speaking about kind of where we are at with changes now, recognizing that young people today are really needing to plan to live in the changes that we see occurring now. So we're starting here with a map of the Earth's ice. You can see in blue all of the Earth's mountain glaciers, and then of course we have the Antarctic ice sheet in the south and the Greenland ice sheet in the northern hemisphere. We can already begin to see dramatic changes in our cryosphere, and we should expect to be making plans that incorporate continuing to deal with these sorts of events occurring. So, for example, we have rain at the summit of the Greenland ice sheet this summer for the first time in kind of observational record. But we certainly shouldn't expect this to be the last time, and we need to start thinking about how are we going to live in this altered cryosphere. Similarly, as we see mountain glaciers lost around the world, what does that mean, and how do we both kind of work to mitigate, but also to adapt to these changes that are coming underway? I want to also, I'm looking forward to our conversation, and well, the day's theme connects with sea level rise. The fresh ice that we see from the world's land ice also plays many other important roles. As we see melt from glaciers, we're looking at its use in agriculture for irrigating fields. Glacier water can be an important drinking water source, also a source for hydropower, and also ecosystem services like helping to keep streams cool so that they're appropriate habitats for fish or invertebrates. So there are a lot of different roles that, even though we represent a small amount of kind of the water on the planet, it's a significant part of the fresh water, and it plays many important roles. So we have to think about how we're adjusting all of these different human health, energy, and agricultural systems as we see glacier change into the future. And of course, sea level rise, where we see sea level rise, the primary components being that thermal expansion as ocean waters warm and naturally take up more volume in the ocean. And then also from this loss of land ice, both the smaller glaciers around the world, those ones that stretch really pole to pole and cross all of the different latitudes, as well as the increasing contribution from the Greenland ice sheet and the increasing contribution from the Antarctic ice sheet, both Greenland and Antarctica, of course, having large reservoirs of potential additions to sea level rise. And today we're at a point where we have roughly a 1/3, 2/3 split between that contribution from thermal expansions of the ocean and contributions from losses of land ice. And we're seeing now also those impacts. So again, we can look to what's happening today, and we can keep in mind that we're not at a point where sea level is going to stabilize or that we are going to see any global reductions in sea level. So planning for a future in which we are really living with this change, and that we are also living with it continuing to change. But the question of what that change is going to look like is still a really big question mark. scientists can look towards the past, and you can see here kind of a sense of these different temperature rises that we've seen in the paleo record, the long-term record, looking at past changes on the Earth's surface, and an understanding of what sea level rise looked at these different temperatures to get a sense of what might be in store. But what's missing from this is really the time scale, the rate of change. And that, of course, is so important for our current societies. Our ability to adapt depends so much on how quickly our seas rise. And this simply does not tell us that sorts of information. And in fact, that's because it's still largely up to us what this rate of future sea level rise will be. So commonly, and here at COP, we have so many conversations that are really focused on an endpoint of 2100. And here you can get a sense that as we take action, many of our sea level rise over the next few decades is really been locked in by past changes that we've seen, past greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to start to really see the impact of the decisions made now several decades from now, as we start to emerge into a future in which we see whether we're getting much more rapid sea level rise or slower rates of sea level rise. And that becomes really pronounced as we move past 2100. So I had, in order to kind of see sea level rise at the right scale, you really have to shrink this first plot so that you can fit on this these values looking out to 2300. And so you can see that really as today's youth are growing, and also as they're thinking about the future for their children and grandchildren, we can start to imagine the individual people who will be living in the world of 2300. And in this time of 2300, we have an incredible difference between what we see for sea level rise with our very low emissions pathways, where we're here staying for the most part under projections of 3 meters of sea level rise by 2300. But with our larger emissions, and certainly if we were to backslide on our global commitments, then we could be seeing much more dramatic global totals. And of course, all of these then translating to the rate of this sea level rise coming to our coasts. So it's up to us, but we are still going to be adapting to this change. Sea level rise is one of those areas where we know change is underway and we know change is coming. So even here, this is an area of the west coast of the Greenland ice sheet. And let's see if this animation plays. This is for some of the low emissions, and this video will take you out looking at the coastal area here of Greenland to 2300. And what I think you can see really well is that we have the ice flowing into the ocean, and these purple areas are showing you where we're exposing new land around the coast. And what I want to emphasize is that we are going to be continuing to see this reconfiguration, this transformation of the cryosphere, of mountain glaciers, of ice sheets, and it's going to radically transform our coasts. Here in Greenland, they're likely to see a lowering of sea level rise, so they will see sea level lowering, and they will be adapting to these changes. For many of our other coasts, especially those far from ice sheets, we'll be dealing with sea level rise and a different kind of reconfiguration of our coast. So it's really important that at the same time we're working towards mitigation, we're thinking about this transformed space of the future, and how will we be developing our communities and our infrastructure to be successful in this transformed coastal environment. And of course, there are other big changes that are coming as we look in the cryosphere. And I just wanted to put this up. It does not emphasize sea level rise or ice sheets, but it does emphasize kind of this transformed Arctic in which the geopolitics of the world will be transformed. The transportation here, you can see the opening up of these different northern sea shipping routes that are, of course, of interest for what does that mean for industry? What does that mean for how nations will work together? Or perhaps how we look towards different forms of international cooperation and communication. So that question also of how we will mitigate and how we will adapt. And one of the things I really wanted to bring in as we look towards this future and people of every age range think about how they will participate in this adaptation and mitigation is an emphasis that sometimes change happens at a transformational speed that we simply cannot imagine. And I really like this slide from the here from the Climate Interactive that helps to emphasize that social changes can feel almost impossible until they begin and they happen rapidly and they spread rapidly. And suddenly we've seen a total transformation in our culture, in our relations with each other. And so I think that we should continue to think about this possibility across all generations, and that potential for us to really still be able to envision and actually realize some of the brightest futures that we can imagine today. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and pass the microphone to Jonathan Bamber from University of Bristol, and to also give us some additional perspective on these icy parts of the system.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Twyla. To be honest with you, I don't think there's much I can add to that. Certainly not in terms of the science. It was a much more polished presentation with much glossier graphics than anything you're going to see from me. So I thought what I'd do is take a rather different perspective and kind of almost ask some questions of you know, our younger panelists, and questions of me as well, and be a tiny bit provocative just to kind of get the conversation going a little bit. So this is, I don't know, one of my favorite climate change cartoons. It's meant to be slightly humorous, but actually it's also quite honest. And the reason for showing this now is because I think if anyone was in the first queue to see an inconvenient truth, it would be the youth, it would be the younger generations. And actually it's people of my generation who've actually been responsible for the mess we're now in, that by and large are in that very long queue wanting to listen to a convenient lie. And I think that's something I would love to discuss with you guys and just get your perspective on that a little bit. So that's kind of a bit of context, one provocation. This slide is a tiny bit complicated. What it shows is on the left, this one, A, is the temperature record, a reconstruction for the temperature record for the last 10,000 years. That's a period called the Holocene. That 10,000 years is the period where modern civilization basically developed. It's when the agricultural revolution took place. It's when we became, you know, when we introduced arable farming techniques. That incredibly stable climate that we saw over the last 10,000 years is what's enabled us to develop the kind of the societies that we have now. On the right, you see the climate for the last, I think, 250,000 years, roughly. You can see, you know, there are big swings, big ups and downs, cold periods, warm periods. It was very variable, and, you know, very difficult for us to develop the sort of processes and in particular modern agriculture that we have today. Modern agriculture is incredibly reliable on a stable climate. What's not shown on this plot is what we've done over the last century. You know, the 1 degree of warming, and this is a proxy for temperature, but if you saw it, you know, and if you looked at in particular greenhouse CO2 emissions, they would be kind of going off the scale. And linked to that is what's happened to sea level rise over the last, what's called the common era, which is the last 2,500 years. That's when we have the most reliable record of past sea level variation. So the top plot shows sea level changes, the bottom plot is temperature, and not surprisingly, the two are pretty much in sync. And what you see on the right-hand side during the 20th century is that sea level rise is higher than it has ever been in the last 2,500 years. But most worryingly is that the rate exceeds anything that we've experienced in that time period. And that is due to what we as humans have been doing to the planet over, in terms, well, to the climate over the last 150 years. I don't know, a little bit of geography. I'm in a geography department in Bristol, so I thought, you know, let's have a bit of geography. This is the Antarctic Ice Sheet to scale. It's a big place. It's 1.5 times the size of Australia. It's bigger than the conterminous USA. It's a big piece of ice. Nobody lives permanently in Antarctica. It can feel a long way away from all of us and quite remote, almost irrelevant. But you know, as Twyla showed, it's actually not. It's if things start happening in Antarctica, we're not going to be able to change that direction that it goes in for centuries to millennia. It's like the super tanker of the climate world. Once you point it in a certain direction, that's it. That's Greenland. These are all to scale. That's the European Alps. I'm not saying that the European Alps aren't important. They're important for very different reasons. But in terms of the total volume of ice on the planet, land ice on the planet, 99.5% is occupied in that thing on the left and this monster down here. And just for scale, that's the UK. So, you know, these are, Antarctica is a big piece of ice. You know, the deepest ice is almost 5 kilometers thick. And just, oops, go back. I don't want to bombard you with lots of numbers, but these are the raw numbers. SLE stands for sea level equivalent. In other words, if we stuck all that ice into the oceans tomorrow, Greenland would be almost 7.5 meters, West Antarctica 5, East Antarctica 58. Altogether, that's 65 meters of sea level rise. Now, just a few meters, just 1 or 2 meters of sea level rise represents an existential threat to nation states, particularly small atolls in the Pacific. You know, so we're talking about losing whole nations. It doesn't get much more serious than that, really. And you know, a recent assessment of coastal topography indicates that a 2-meter sea level rise, which is not out of the question by 2100 if we carry on our current trajectory of increasing emissions, will displace about 630 million people worldwide. So those, you know, those are the consequences and sort of, you know, the potential prospects of melting ice around the world. That's it for me. And I think we're going to hand over. I'm not quite sure who's first off. Do you want to, any thoughts? I think it's, did you want to say something first or no. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll get some chat. So I think everyone, the panel's going to come up and then we're going to have a dialogue and I guess open it up for questions as well. And apologies, I'm sort of slightly losing my voice, so I'm very croaky. Apologies. Yeah, and we'll use the mic.
You're so fine. How about I can move over? No? Twyla, do you want to get the conversation started?
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Divya, and I'm from India. I'm an Arctic angel with Global Choices, and it's a network of young women from around the world trying to bring more attention to the ice crisis today. And I'm really grateful to both Twyla and to Jonathan to be able to bring the science and the understanding that they have brought here today. So just a background, I've been to Antarctica twice over the last 10 years, and I've had the opportunity to experience climate change firsthand. And in fact, I've experienced the ozone hole. The ozone hole was formed before I was born. However, when I went to Antarctica, my eyes went red, and I was able to say that I actually am suffering from the impacts of what we did to our environment and our planet more than 35 years ago. And so, as a young person coming from the Indian Peninsula region, especially when you showed the slide about the coastlines, and to connect the dots to a place I've actually had the honor and privilege to go, and not many people in the world do. It really was kind of touching to kind of get acknowledged for it, to be able to say that yes, this is happening, this is something that is being experienced, and to be able to look at those cities on the map where you had Bombay, Jakarta. I've lived in Jakarta, I've lived in Manila. As a young professional, I've traveled and worked in these places, and to be able to kind of connect the dots and say that that the ice is already melting beneath our feet. In fact, in my case, I actually saw the icebergs melting in Antarctica, and to be able to connect that was really really great, but also really kind of overwhelming. It makes me wonder. I want to kind of especially ask Jonathan this question on what do you think the future will look like for young people in India? We are going to be the largest youth population on the planet. And so what do you think it will look like for young Indians, especially? And there's Himalayas in the north for India. So there's glaciers up north and sea level for the south, which is like a long coastline. So could you share something about that? Thank you.
I'll do my best. I mean, I'm not an oracle, and as Einstein said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So I don't know. I think it's certain that it's going to be very different from today. One of the biggest problems that the Indian subcontinent faces is not just coastal flooding, but what's called salinification of coastal aquifers. So sea level rises, these freshwater aquifers that are incredibly important for agriculture and for human consumption get contaminated with salt water. That's a major problem. And I mean, as Twyla implied, if we stopped carbon emissions today, sea level is going to continue to rise going into the future. There's a huge amount of thermal inertia in the oceans. The ice sheets and glaciers respond over decades to centuries. Some of that response is locked in already. But I think, what the future really looks like, what it's going to be like in 2100, there's still so much to play for. It could look, and I was talking to a colleague earlier, climate change is not binary. If COP26 is a success, that doesn't mean things are great. If it's not successful, it doesn't mean things are disastrous. It's how bad or how much do we want to limit the damage that there's going to be in the future. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that's up to all of us. It's up to humanity. The signs at this meeting are you know, so far a little bit mixed. I've been going to COP meetings for almost 20 years, and you know, you get a feel for how things are going. But you know, I think there's still an awful lot to play for.
I can give a quick introduction. My name is Amy. I am an employee at ICCI, and I recently graduated from my undergraduate institution with a degree in chemistry and English. So I'm very interested in science communication and science writing, where you take scientific information and data and research, and that's normally in a very difficult language to understand. And you simply take out the main points. You take out what the researchers wanted everyone to know, because often researchers spend years and years, you know, pulling together all this data, and all they want is for people to do something with it. Like, they don't want it just to go into the void and you know, sit in an online research paper database. You know, they want people to engage with it. So I think having, you know, mediaries like such as journalists and just like communicators in general to be that in between and just communicate the important, you know, things that, you know, even the young people and other generations to come need to know is very important. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And so I guess my question for everyone here is just, what do you think is the most important message from your research or your experience that you think people should know? Because often it's, you know, there's many things that you talk about every day, and just like, is there something that's changed the way you think about climate, or what do you think people should know?
So, of course, I'd like everyone to know more than one little tad, but I think some of the most important elements from studying ice sheets is this element of understanding that we're in a place of continuing evolution of our coasts, and that this is something that there's been a real increase in glaciological research over the last couple of decades, and we're in a place where there's much that we can tell about the future. So, for example, as you ask about what India will look like, and having the changes in the Himalaya, which will bring perhaps increased initial water availability as you see glaciers melt, and you might actually see a real increase in water availability, a boon for agriculture or hydropower, but that will at some point cross a curve, and there will be then a reduction in water availability. And being able, I think, in kind of our new generations, being able to better understand long-term planning and kind of an ability to be adaptable and thinking about flexible changes into the future, as well as at the coasts, as you think about areas that could be developed today but would no longer be available for development in several decades. And I think that there's a lot of if we turn to looking at the actual scenarios behind the low emissions scenarios, they tell us about what our social and cultural and geopolitical behavior might help in these situations. And a lot of it is about collaboration and about working together. And I think that that applies across kind of all of our different local, regional, international landscapes. The more that we can start to cultivate our relationships with each other and our ability to collaborate rather than becoming more insular, that's going to really make us more adaptable to these changes that we see coming in the future. And it's certainly, as I'm in the Arctic, I hear about this from indigenous Arctic people who, for time immemorial, have been living in the Arctic and adjusting to changes. And a critical part of this was that in many cases they were able to move around the landscape, and that's something that we're not very good at doing today. But perhaps we could think about how we could do that better, and that requires a real cooperation that I think we can all work towards fostering too.
Can I just say a really, like, 1 minute? it's nothing to do with science, but to answer that question, so I've been working on this problem for many years. I think the one thing one message is that as individuals, we can actually feel really powerless and unable to do anything. But I really like Twyla's example of how civil society, how you can get step changes, you can get these inflection points. And I've seen it happen in, lots of different things. And I think we're not powerless. Each of us can make a difference, actually. So that's the one message I would give. We really can.
And then also, prepare for other questions.
Hello. Can you hear me? My name is Emma, and I'm a Danish youth delegate. And can you hear me?
Not.
I could repeat this too.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
if you repeat it. Yeah.
Okay,
to
cool.
us.
Well, my question is, because it's a bit of a long one, so look forward to that. Well, my name is Emma. I'm a Danish youth delegate. I'm part of the Danish delegation. But my question is because I heard you guys speaking about the long and the short term effects of the ice melting. And maybe in the short term, it could be good, but in the long term, it will become problematic. And I find this issue is often a big problem, especially from the Nordics, where I'm from, where, yes, in short term, climate change could be a bit nice for us. It's warmer. And I hear people, especially climate change deniers and people who don't see it as that big of a crisis, only looking at the short term and saying, looking at this. So how, when you speak to researchers and politicians, do you get them to look beyond that? Because I think it's sometimes a bit of an issue when we speak about climate change that, yeah, maybe in 70 years will be nice, but look at 115 years and 200 years. How do you tackle this challenge of communicating in a way where they understand the long-term perspectives and don't only look at the short term?
Just a. Oh, I don't need that. I'll kick off, and then I guess Twyla says so. It's not just here. This is why we're in this mess. Why do OPEC countries still think it's okay to dig up more oil? Who are they going to sell oil to in a century? So it's a universal problem, and it's a trait of human nature. We are programmed as a species to worry about what's right in front of us. If we've got the saber-toothed tiger, just about to jump on us, that's our priority. It's very difficult for us to see too far in the future. It's very difficult for any political party to do that because they won't stay in power. And I think the other, I think the whole climate change problem is all about money. It's all about the economics. Basically, if the money goes in the right direction, everything else will. But economists have this idea, they discount the future. So, some cost, some event in the future has a discount rate. And if you look 100 years from now, whatever it is has no value. And so, your question goes to almost everything, the way we think about everything, really.
So I know human behavior is basically like, it's not going to change today. It's not going to change tomorrow. It hasn't changed. Even like 30, 40 years ago, environmentalists are talking about it, but only now we're talking about circular economies, right? It was linear all this while. I think you also mentioned about trade routes. So trade economics is so interconnected, and I think that's also going to impact Arctic so closely, like the Northwestern Passage and all these new trade routes that are like going to be opening up. So I'm wondering, what do you think some leaders here can do? I mean, it doesn't have to be like, COP26 has to be a success and it has to be decided today. But can there be like some strict actions that can be taken, especially in the Arctic, to stop the polar ice melt? And that could also then not lead to like the massive, trade and economic explosion that will happen because of these, melting shipping routes. Do you have any inputs on that?
Yeah, this is a interesting question. I mean, in part, we need to be very clear about the reality that the ice in the Arctic, sea ice, is opening up, and that there are opportunity spaces there, not in a not to belittle the climate changes, but we need to be realistic about the changes that are occurring in our landscape and how people are going to interact with those changes. And certainly many of the people living in the Arctic have not been big contributors to climate change, but we do see them taking these changes seriously. The new Greenland government, for example, has been very serious about stopping exploration for gas and oil, and taking more seriously how they might develop industries that support renewable technologies. So these are kind of elements of change that are going to be underway. Russia is certainly thinking about how they are going to increase Arctic shipping, and I think they have an expectation of having year-round Arctic shipping by 2024. These are real changes that are coming, but I think within this, it's realizing that in part, we need a system transformation of how we lead and how we work, but that system transformation won't happen without us all pushing for it, speaking about it, envisioning what it looks like, and really bringing pressure. We heard yesterday here at the Cryosphere Pavilion from the Scottish Minister of the Environment, and I asked her about, on the science end, who needs this information as we look at who we're going to talk with, and she spoke about the importance of having the public and citizens be able to put pressure on their governments, having businesses. Many, of course, we can look at multinational companies who can put pressure on governments around the world. So I think that we can't discount how we can pressurize these kind of decision areas. Certainly the youth movement in Europe, I think, was a very big influencer of the European Green Deal. So these are areas where everyone has a voice, and the more voices that we can raise up, I think the more quickly we can see these transitions happen. And in part, it's envisioning how they can happen and really working towards that positive future vision. But it does require some reconsideration of power, of what we value economically, and how we might translate some of these very difficult elements, how we could work towards not discounting the future, how we can raise up that it is much more affordable for us to address the climate crisis now than in the future. And I think, as to your question about bringing that long-term vision to policy and decision makers, in part it is understanding what the values of these different people are. Every audience person has a different interest in different elements of the climate crisis and what might influence them. And certainly I think people can kind of brush a broad stroke, perhaps. I'm sitting in Norway, and wouldn't I love it if the sun was shining and it was a little warmer now? But think realistically about, what is the agriculture there? How are food systems? How would Norway also deal with increasing immigration and some of these others? And that it might really be that stabilizing as close as we can today is in fact the best place to be. And I think finding kind of people's specific interests is really important for helping to bring that message home. There's not a single message that is going to get through to every person, which of course would be so much easier, but is simply not true. I'm really interested to hear from each of you on kind of what conversations that you participate with your peers, and what are people most excited about or thinking about moving forward, and how those conversations happen.
To answer part of your question, a lot of people I'm around often ask when they hear I'm involved in like a climate organization, like, is it not worth, individual action? Should we just focus on policy? Should we focus on collective action? Like, how do we tackle climate change? Because there isn't a straightforward answer to this. And I think a lot of people quickly, say like individual action just doesn't have a big enough impact. We can't rely on that as a solution. But I would also like to point out to that, while we do need policy change, we need that it's one of the most critical things that COP can bring us. We also need to inspire people to know that their individual action does matter, and it matters quite a bit. Because if one person changes, then their family unit will recognize, well, okay, they've gone vegan. Like, why are they doing? They'll inquire within. And I think, if more people start talking about it, if it becomes normalized, I think it's going to have really good repercussions on policymakers, because they'll start seeing it in their families and in their communities. So that's just what what conversations I've been engaged in.
On the same lines, because I talk quite a bit about my own personal experience in Antarctica and being a part of the Arctic Angels network, a lot of people are curious, like why I'm so passionate about the ice and what it means for all of us. And I keep reminding them that we cannot look at and I think it has to do with a lot of human history that today we are the most connected in the world ever. So how can we not think of ourselves as like one entity and one humanity? And so I think if you're able to think of each one of us as a part of a big ecosystem, and then create the ecosystem and consider the ecosystem to be one, then we are able to kind of make also decisions which work for the better of everyone on the planet. And I think the conversations that I have is all about looking at, like thinking globally and acting locally, and to be able to say that what impact I'm having on with a certain action today on the, big picture of, how is it impacting the ice sheets in the Arctic, and also how is it affecting the future generations. And I think with education, as Amy mentioned, we kind of, have to kind of look at that big picture. When I was in school, climate science wasn't a part of my curriculum, but I hope that my kids will have it, so that they can be better informed and be able to make better decisions. And I think those are the conversations we need to be having every day about how we can empower ourselves. Yeah.
So I'd like to ask both of you, and perhaps some of the audience as well, a slightly personal question. So my generation, is pretty much responsible for this. The last 30 years, we have emitted more than half of the total CO2 emissions that have taken place since the Industrial Revolution. So I, and people of my generation are pretty much responsible for the mess we're in. And I just wondered, how you see us, this older generation that have caused this horrible mess that you are going to have to clear up.
According to my own understanding and my research, my take is that a lot of this was a part of the recovery after the two big wars. And at that time, as Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of it was about poverty eradication and reducing a lot of human suffering. It just happened that environmental cost was not considered. The environment cost and social cost of what kind of resources were put into like electricity and energy, transport, and all these kind of avenues, which made human life better, were not accounted in the right manner. And that's why the cost, the carbon cost now that we talk about is falling upon the future generations, including mine. And like I said, I experienced the ozone hole 30 years after it was formed. So yes, we are going to be the ones who's going to experience it. But I also think that the leaders here today are also the old generation that caused this problem, or maybe it was their parents' generation who made those decisions to create these institutions in a certain way, and they were the ones who reaped the benefits. So now it's time for them to give back. if they don't give back now, they will never get an opportunity again. So this is the right time for intergenerational work to happen, where the older generations can actually come and tell the younger generations that, okay, this is what has happened and this is what we can do better for you. So I really don't see that it is a lost cause yet, and I hope that it is not a lost cause 5 years from now. And I think the success of COP26 will not be known today. It will be in 5 years from now, because Paris Agreement was 6 years ago, and we're still struggling that, nothing has happened what was promised at Paris. So 5 years from now, we need to be talking about like what was promised in Glasgow. Has it been, have the word has been kept? And I think that's where we need the intergenerational work. And I think if we don't work together, we're never going to solve this crisis.
I can give a quick insight into my perspective. Just from what I've gone through, I've realized that it's very easy to get comfortable in the lifestyle that you live, and you stop thinking about everything that's involved in your lifestyle. So you'll drive to work, you'll be at work, you'll print off all these papers, you'll come home, you'll throw the papers away, maybe you'll recycle them. And you don't realize exactly what you're doing until you hold a conversation, or you see someone doing something different, and you realize, maybe I could reduce that way. I could, shift my lifestyle that way. But for a lot of people that are in older generations than mine, they grew up with different ways of living. So they would print off, emails and websites and directions for everything. And I think being flexible and listening is a really, really important thing that the adults, and I think at least in my life and in everyone's life, can bring to the table for this.
We have time for a very short question and short answer. So please come.
Yes, hello. Thank you. My name is Perla. I'm from the Icelandic Youth Environmentalist Association. I'm also an architect, but now I'm trying to study the little that you can of oceanography in Iceland. So you call a lot for the what the future will look like, and for me, this is what I am educated in and was learning during my studies. So I'm used to being like drawing this future, and now I find myself trying to learn oceanography because I really want to the conversation between, for example, scientists and artists. I think is very important. And Amy, thank you for writing these reports in a communicative way. But yeah, so I had an example of how I was drawing it, but I did a project in a 10-meter flooded future. So basically, the land has been so the land has gone away, but the houses have become islands, and their roofs are the only land left. So this was the land that I was to inhabit in my project, and drew it on the roofs. So you were saying that 630 million people are at risk. So I kind of wanted to ask you how you see a collaboration between these parts, because you are asking for this vision for the future, and there is a full sector of people drawing that, but these two sectors often seem very segregated. And then just the last question is about Antarctica, a geological question. If all the ice melts, will it be inhabitable land left, or is it underwater?
It could be quite chilly. Well, the last question. So some of it, the west side will be underwater, but the east is a huge continent. Probably lots of minerals to exploit, and keep us going in our comfortable lifestyles for another few centuries, maybe.
There will certainly also in Greenland be quite a transformation of the landscape, and totally new ocean waters opening up, totally new land opening up, and coasts, the world around will be looking different. The waterways will look different. The plants there will look different. But I love that you brought up art and architecture and physical sciences and all of these. And I think one of the things that is required for imagining this future is all that collaboration that is not only kind of happen between people of different cultures or different nations, but also people working on these different topics. And I do think that, and I hope that we've continued to get better and better at nurturing really a way of systems thinking and cross collaboration within younger generations and abilities to have conversations in which all of these different perspectives are valued. I think that there's been a lot of progress in understanding the importance of bringing many diverse perspectives, and that's really how we best solve problems and how we best move forward, and also best communicate with those people who need to hear about these messages and make these envisioned realities truth. So I agree that I would love to see more of it. I think more of that kind of communication is happening, certainly much more than I see now than when I was first a glaciologist. And I think that our younger generations are really well positioned to continue this kinds of system conversation and understanding, you know, the connections between living spaces, health, food, agriculture, what's happening at our coasts, what's happening in these icy elements of the cryosphere. So we can't ignore this sort of cooperation and understand that it's important to start those conversations and openly sort of like fumble forward, as it's sometimes called, not being so tentative about asking questions or learning something new, and kind of a willingness to make this fumble forward, because we understand that together we're going to get to this better future, and we should do that bravely, even if it sometimes means we make mistakes or we don't quite know what we're doing along the way.
So I think that, I thank you everyone for this very interesting session. And in 10 minutes, even less, the session continue here with Greenland's tipping point. So stay here and be tuned, because we will continue. Thank you very much.